All right, I think I'm live again. Appreciate your patience as I work out a new setup here. I don't yet have it, but I appreciate those of you who are able to throw some money my way. I was able to get a nice microphone, and when it arrives, it will improve my ability to do these streams. But I was just listening to this debate that the Integral Stage hosted. That's the name of the YouTube channel. Layman Pascal was the moderator of this debate between Brent Cooper, who is he's a sociologist and an eco-socialist, and Brian O'Doherty, who is a sort of libertarian panarchist, I guess. And they were arguing about healthcare and whether the state should even exist or not. And here, I want to play just a minute of it so you get a sense, and then try to offer my own take, maybe from a philosophical perspective on where they were failing to meet each other. And, I think Lehman was doing a great job moderating, but there's never an end to the moderation that's needed, especially when we're trying to deal with this modern left-right, progressive, conservative, capitalist, socialist division. Um, but here, listen, and here's this is Brian.
And I don't philosophically, I don't I don't buy that. I don't buy ends justify means arguments. Those arguments fall flat for me because I think they're ethically lacking. In other words, they're not based on a fundamental voluntarist axiom of do no harm. So we're starting from completely different starting points, and that's the problem. You cannot come to agreement on the top end in the details if you don't first agree on the fundamentals, and we disagree on the fundamentals.
What do you think would be required in order to get agreement on the fundamentals? Like, you're looking over at Brent. What would you need to hear from him before you felt like your fundamentals were being included in what he's talking about?
Well, he would have to agree with my fundamental axiom, my beginning point. He'd have to agree that force is bad and persuasion is good, and the only legitimate way to make social change is through persuasion.
Brent, do you agree with those things?
Of course, and that's why the left is anti-war and tries to use the mechanisms of the democracy in the forced West. The two.
So there's a lot in that brief exchange there that I want to unpack, and I think it's really at the core of the issue for me, which is that so Brian's trying to hold down for a kind of foundationalism in his political theory, which is to say that for him it all goes back to this first principle, which is an ethical principle, which is do no harm. It's a non-aggression principle. He thinks that force is never okay, that force is always evil. And Brian wants his vision of an ideal society would be one wherein only persuasion is permitted. There's no force. And he got into an argument with Brent about whether, let's say, Bernie Sanders had won the election and he got the Democrats to go along with instituting Medicare for all, right? A government-run single-payer health insurance program, basically. It's health insurance that's not for profit. It's health insurance to actually help people get the care that they need. It takes the middleman of these private for-profit insurance companies out of the picture, which last I checked, they don't really add anything to the quality of the care given by doctors or nurses or hospitals. The insurance companies are just like most capitalist corporations, extracting profit from a system that really doesn't need them in order to work. And So there were I want to get more into healthcare because there were some I think outrageous things that Brian was saying. But the issue here is that for Brian, if Bernie were to institute this plan, it would be violence by proxy or force by proxy because Bernie would be stealing. I assume Brian's word that about the violence implied by stealing rich people's money to pay for this single payer government run plan, right? It would require raising taxes on very wealthy people. And Brian thinks that that is theft, that that is the use of force by the majority who voted in Bernie um, against, the majority's use of force against a minority that doesn't want to participate in that system. And, this is the classic libertarian, um, I think, confused idea that taxation is theft. I think there's a lot to what is money. Before we can even talk about taxes and the ethics of taxation, we need to understand what money is. And in the context of a central banking system with a fiat currency such as we have in this country, constitutionally, the Congress is supposed to have the authority to print money and to mint coin, right? But I believe since the amendment that Wilson helped get passed in the 19 teens, was it, I forget which amendment, that created the Federal Reserve Bank and this quasi-private, nonetheless public institution that was supposed to have political autonomy from Congress. They decided what interest rates were and how much money was created, right? But still, Congress is supposed to have the authority. And I think that is problematic, that a private investment community of very wealthy people has a say in how our supposedly democratic republic is supposed to create more money. Ideally, Congress, which would be representative of the interests and needs of the people, would print money to invest in the sorts of projects that are necessary for the general welfare of the people of the country. And, for example, when we go to war, when we went to war in the 20th century, lots of money was created by the government. It's mostly why we were able to lift ourselves out of a depression, because of that government expenditure on killing Nazis and defeating fascism in Europe. We needed to invest massively from the government in order to defeat Hitler. And the problem is that a lot of that government investment has continued since we won World War II, but mostly for the military, instead of for our roads and bridges and our schools, our hospitals, and so on. We've used modern monetary theory, as it's called, to further enrich the defense industry and all the other major corporate industries, rather than using the what should be the democratically controlled ability to make money to invest in what's best for society, which includes individuals. And so, there's a whole question, I think, around how we think of money rather than being private property. Maybe we need to start to see money as a public good. And, in that's what does debt become in that sense? And what does profit become? If we're thinking of money, currency, as a means of exchange, it's a language ultimately. Money is a mode of communication. It's how we transfer value, and it's how we invest in what we find valuable. And so, if we think of it as a public good, it forces us to reimagine debt and profit, and I think start to see them maybe from a more just perspective that doesn't praise those who make a profit and blame and belittle those who are in debt, as if it's a individual moral characteristic that determines whether one is rich or poor, whether one is profiting or debting or in debt, right? We have a whole, in our neoliberal capitalist political economy, a whole morality of money that makes it seem like just because you're a billionaire, you're a good person. I'm not necessarily saying that billionaires are bad people. It's just I think it's a reflection of the fact that we've convinced ourselves or been convinced that money is private property when really money to function as intended is supposed to be a public good. Hoarding money in the way that capitalism allows, it would be akin to like someone trying to um, have all the words for themselves and like prevents other people from using their words, as if it's like just a misunderstanding about how language works and why we talk to each other. Um, and so, that this is in the background. It's the ontology of money, I guess, in the conversation that and the debate that Brent and Brian are having. But there are other issues, philosophical issues of like political um, ontology. Like, what are the categories that we're even thinking in terms of, right? In the modern period, usually the main categories are like the individual and society, or the market and the state, or man and nature, right? And these are, I think, problematic categories, right? That we might want to deconstruct a little bit. I mean, it's not like I think we can. What's in the background of libertarianism of the sort that Brian is putting forward is this sense of a political ontology of individualism, right? That the state of nature would be akin to the free market, where individuals who are free to act on their desires and needs, uh, through um, networks of nonviolent exchange, they come to create markets. And I think abstractly it's a nice idea, but if you look at the anthropological evidence for how early human beings uh, organize themselves socially, this liberal notion of human beings beginning as autonomous rational actors is false. It's false, and I think there's a need to consider the ways in which it's not that I would want to say, in opposition to liberal individualism, that no, actually, society as a whole, these structures of political economy and culture are what are creating individuals, and that that in other words, that somehow um, what's really real is this abstract entity called society, and the individual is just derivative from it. I think there's a real tension between individuality and sociality, but and that neither one of these can precede the other. And so this is my problem with foundationalism of any kind, like beginning with first principles in the way that Brian wants to. He begins with the principle of do no harm. Like, it's not really a first principle. It assumes a political ontology of isolated individuals. Um, it assumes some other things too, but I think rather than beginning with first principles, we need to begin in the middle of things, right? In media res, like we need to begin in a more pragmatic sense with whatever is at hand, and recognize the way that these big abstractions like individual society or market and state, man and nature, like these big abstractions don't necessarily reflect or represent reality, that they are really modern constructs that when put into when put into historical context, really begin to make less sense and seem rather absurd. So the idea that there is something like a market that exists in a pure state separate from a government that somehow imposes all of these bureaucratic rules and regulations and stuff and violence, and as if these two have ever existed separately, right? Like as if capitalism, the global market, and colonialism, right, and science and slavery, as if these things are just part of totally separate spheres of reality. Like, no, that all emerged and arose uh, together and mutually reinforced and amplified one another. Um, you can't understand capitalism without the history of colonization. Um, you just can't do it. You can't understand the rise of the capitalist economic might of the United States without the institution of slavery. And, the idea that somehow, that Brian would suggest that his principle of do no harm somehow prevents socialism from being the political theory to be implied by the principle of do no harm. It's as if Brian thinks that the capitalist setup as it currently exists, with the tremendous inequalities of wealth and the class hierarchies, as if that situation wasn't established by violence which has occurred in the past and continues to occur every day. I mean, the only reason we have an 8-hour workday, the only reason 6-year-olds aren't still digging for coal in the mines is because of people organized themselves and revolted against the rich and the capitalists in order to win these rights. Um, and to sort of for Brian to say that, show me one example of socialism ever working, it's like, you know, the history of labor struggle is bloody. Um, I only know, I know more about it in this country than other countries, but I know it's probably even bloodier elsewhere. Um, the quality of life that average working people have in capitalism, which since neoliberalism after Reagan for the last several decades, uh, that balance between labor and capital has been lost. But before that, like the balance that there was won through mass revolt um, by the people against the leaders of industry and the winners of the so-called free market game, monopoly game. It's like it's called monopoly for a reason, right? It gets monopolized because again, money is imagined as private property. And so yeah, if your ethical principle is do no harm, I think we have to look at the history of capitalism and colonial expansion, which again are two sides of the same coin. Um, and do no harm. Yeah, what would it look like to undo all the harm that has already been done by a particular mode of production and the class hierarchy that it creates? So I think there are ways, though, that socialism, eco-socialism in particular, that we need to language this differently. Like um, Jeremy Johnson and the other guys over at the Growing Down podcast were talking to Ben Burgess, I think his name is, from Jacobin, and he made this great point about how Bernie should have spoken more about freedom and appealed to the value of freedom that many Americans have, so that he would market his policy proposals differently. Something like Medicare for All, for example, could be described as enhancing the freedom of working people to be able to choose their place of employment without having to worry about losing their health care. And it would also provide more freedom to small businesses who wouldn't need to worry about paying as much money for group insurance plans. So there are ways in which we socialists can, and Bernie's not even really a socialist, right? He's not trying to nationalize all the industries. He's trying to give capitalism a human face again. He's trying to restore the old FDR balance between labor and capital, which isn't ending capitalism. Um, and I think it's many of us who maybe who are more radical in our vision for what an ideal society would look like would see a Bernie presidency more as a platform for the deeper transformation at the level of culture and consciousness that's ultimately going to be needed for us to survive this evolutionary bottleneck. Like Bernie's just a beginning. And when you think in those larger terms, I'm interested to hear more of what Brian has to say about panarchy, an understanding of politics in the context of complex systems. But if that all cashes out as a kind of libertarianism, I think there's issues there because again, the libertarian is making some assumptions at the level of political ontology that I think are unjustified. And it would be interesting to have a dialogue, with Brent too, but also Brian about, the first principles beneath his first principles, and maybe question whether or not it's even politically, um, if it even makes sense politically to be a foundationalist of any kind rather than being open to, the notion of reality as a process, right? And that our attempts to compose common worlds together, which is how I would define the politics is the endeavor to compose common worlds. If that's what politics is, then you know starting your public discourse with other members of your polis with "this is my principle and I'm not budging" isn't really a good way to invite um, the political. It's more of a way to invite war, or because the political would be you're willing to be diplomatic, you're willing to uh, consider the interests of others and see how your own interests that you arrived with might be transformed in alliance with other interests, and that maybe even new interests could be brought forth that formerly separate parties didn't realize that they shared. Um, that would be more my sense of how to do politics, particularly if we're aiming for democratic politics, which doesn't have to just mean voting and majority wins. We want at least a constitutional democracy that protects rights, regardless of what the majority might want. But we also need an openness as a democracy to questioning even our political economy. And in the United States, there just hasn't been enough room for that. And so, I'm glad that debates like this are taking place. And I think we should and can deepen the conversation. Um, because I agree with Brian ultimately that persuasion must win out over force as the main driver of political transformation. But, the problem is, again, like, depending on how far back in history we want to look, where the violence started is always going to be in question. And so to say that the socialist revolutionary is the one who's being violent, as if, the capitalist order under whose heel they were prior, as if that order itself wasn't horrifically violent, and that the global capitalist market enriching all these billionaires is only possible because of the threat of force of the military industrial complex and the Pentagon, the Pentagon's empire. And that power, militaristic power, is shifting now. The United States isn't as dominant as it once was, right? And so we're seeing the massive economic results of that shift in military power, because these things, states, markets, in the modern period, two sides of the same coin here. We can't think of these as abstractly as I think was occurring in this conversation, this debate with Brian and Brent. So, truth be told, I still have maybe another half hour of this to watch, and then maybe I'll have more to say. But I'll probably leave it at that for now, and catch up with some of your comments and see what else I have to say. And I'll link to this video I'm talking about. Some of you are asking about that. And yeah, appreciate your attention.